Yeah, very good morning, ladies and gentlemen. So, from all the efforts of the panel one to clear the AQI and to dream of a much lower AQI, this panel will take you to stories of deceit, disinformation, covert operations, all of this which are going to make the air dense and probably take the AQI much more higher. So, we'll balance it out. And the man responsible for this is none other than Mangesh Sawant, who has created this amazing, amalgamation of 7 stories in his book called as Hidden Warfare. And some stories are known, some stories are unknown, and we'll make an effort to, delve into each of these stories, take out some lessons as to what we can have and what the relevance is there as far as, today's world is concerned. So, let me first touch upon an aspect which is not very well known in India. There is a story which Mangesh has written, and that is called as India's very own Pearl Harbor. So, in the World War II, somewhere around 1941 and the mid 1942s, what had happened was there was a grand plan which had been made by both Germany and Japan across the globe during those days, and the plan was finally to link Europe with Asia, with both the powers coming up together. Something like a railway line coming all the way from Hamburg to Basra, and while the Japanese army would march all the way across to the Middle East, at that time the second largest congregation of oil resources in the world in that. So while we have all read about the German blitzkrieg operations in World War II, a lot of studies have been done on that. Mangesh, my first question to you is, how would you define this Eastern blitzkrieg, which the world should also know?
Thanks, Vibhu. All of us, especially the military historians from Europe and US, they are focused on the European theatre of warfare during World War I and World War II. What I found by writing this book is the neglected part is the Eastern theatre, what happened in the Pacific theatre. And one of the finest battles were fought in the Pacific theatre. Most of the battles in the West, in the Europe, were focused on the land warfare and some in the Atlantic warfare. But if you see the Eastern theatre in Asia Pacific, the most of the battles were fought by the Navy, by the US Navy and the Imperial Japanese Navy and the British Navy. So my focus was to dig out some of the stories which are quite unknown, and this was one of the amazing stories which happened just off the steps of India. 2 Imperial Japanese Navy battleships, they came from Japan, they entered Singapore. They destroyed 2 ships in Singapore, British ships. Then they entered through the Malacca Straits. They came down, and one of the Imperial Japanese naval battleship destroyed the port of Trincomalee. Another battle group went into the Bay of Bengal. It started hammering Calcutta, which was known that time. Today is Kolkata. Then it came down and hammered Chennai. That time it was known as Madras. And one of the fantastic anecdote is that the entire city of Chennai, that time around 220,000 people were evacuated by the Governor General of Madras during Madras provincial state during that time, and most of them moved to the higher hills in the Nilgiris to the city of Uti and Coimbatore. So that was interesting. And we talk about the blitzkrieg which happened in Europe from 1939 to 1941 or 42. It took around 3 years, 2 to 3 years. But the Japanese blitzkrieg, which is neglected by military historians, took around 150 days, around 5 months, or little more than 150 days. They started with Pearl Harbor. They came down to China, Manchuria. They came down Hong Kong. They took over Philippines. They came down to Indonesia. Then they took over Singapore. The next stop was Sri Lanka. This happened in 150 days, which is quite amazing. And unfortunately, I have been studying about the warfare. No Western author talks about this.
This is pretty amazing, the way the center of gravity for the Royal Navy shifted from that being Australia to Ceylon, and even Trincomalee getting bombed, Madras that time again getting bombed, and a host of ships, the capital ships getting lost. Very interestingly, the Royal Navy also lost their aircraft carrier, and which has some dotted line connect to us also. The HMS Hermes, which was sunk in the Bay of Bengal. Of course, a decade and a half later, it rose like a phoenix again. The new HMS Hermes came into play, took part in Falkland Wars and came to Indian Navy as INS Virat. That's a different story altogether. Now, in this aspect, one thing is there, Mangesh, that the way the Japanese went about, rapid switching of forces. They had the entire carrier battle groups they deployed in the Pacific, where they carried out the Pearl Harbor operations. They moved them all the way back to the Indian Ocean and the Bay of the Bengal area, and again back within 6 months of the Battle of Midway in Coral Sea. So this kind of operational flexibility which has been brought in by the Japanese is actually worth learning and reading about. My question to you is next is Dr. Sanjeev. When we talk about these campaigns and operations, we also learn about the Bhabha campaign, and that also brings us to a paradox because not only the British Indian Army had mostly Indian troops and the regiments. By the time the Japanese reached Kohima and Imphal, there was a component of the INA also. So your thoughts on that, please?
Thank you. I think the Burma campaign is so interesting in the context of the fact that if you look at how first to fall was Penang, then after that Hong Kong fell, after that Singapore fell. Until the fall of Singapore, the British never thought that Singapore will have to surrender. But Singapore surrendered, Churchill lost it. Churchill lost it not because 1 lakh people surrendered. He said that 16,000 Britishers and 32,000 Australians have surrendered. He said, so my white man has surrendered. He was not bothered about the surrender of the Asians and the Africans. He was bothered about that. But that is what shook him. But that was the time when the 15th Army of Japan, I think the 15th Army of Japan, that started moving into Burma, and by 8th of March, Burma was also gone. And then this army started moving in towards Kohima, towards Imphal, and that's where the 14th Army, incidentally I must tell you that the three generals whom Churchill had written off, these three generals were Wavell. He didn't like Wavell because he felt that Wavell wasn't aggressive enough. He didn't like Auchinleck because he felt that although Auchinleck was the one who stopped Rommel, but he felt that Auchinleck was not strong enough. And Slim, he had a very poor opinion about Slim. But it was these three generals who got together and created the 14th Army of Slim, created the V-Force and Senkol. And because interesting thing to note is that in this campaign, the British government deliberately underplayed the role of the British troops and highlighted the role of the Indians because they did not want. They wanted the Indians to get prominence because they wanted to create the feeling that the INA is useless, and therefore they promoted. In fact, a lot of war histories that have been written by the British generals, they say that why weren't we given the credit? They weren't given the credit because at that time the credit had to be given to Assam Rifles, credit had to be given to Assam Regiment. So ultimately, in a war, what matters is the narrative. So the narrative is sometimes more important than the war, and I think the study of the Burma campaign shows, yes, of course, Lim was there, but then you get all the Indian names there, you get Limbu Rai, you get all these, and the other aspect about this was that because of this, the number of ECOs who joined the Indian Army. You see, when the World War II started, there was a component of Indian officers in the British Indian Army was very few. By the time the operations ended, by the time the Burma campaign ended, about 33% of the officer corps was Indian. So we had 15,000 Indian emergency commissioned officers. So I think that is one aspect about the Burma campaign which has not brought out into the Indianization. In fact, there's a very interesting thing that when Auchinleck's predecessor, he was opposed to the Indianization of the army. Motilal Nehru said that look, we're not asking for Indianization of the army, we are wanting the Europeans to get rid of the Indian army and restore the Indian army back to India. So I think all wars change narratives in a manner which was unintended. So I don't think Europe, the Axis, their thoughts may have been very different. But the outcome of a war is very different from how it starts.
Absolutely, sir. And I think what we need to do within India is also to learn about these wars more and more in the context of India as such and the implication. Very interesting, thought came to my mind when I was going through Mangesh's book. The British had made a complete network of HF communications for interception, and the main hub was in a place on Aravali Ridge in New Delhi, and that place is called as Anand Parvat, and that's the highest point in Delhi where the hub was made. And that is where all the interceptions are finally being done and collated. In 2001, my regiment moved there. We were occupying the same place, same hillock, and the same house, but the history given to us was that it was probably an Italian PW, camp during the World War II. And we used to always wonder that there are remnants of that antenna park. So what will a PW park do with the antenna park? Of course, by that time, those kind of, big antennas and everything had long past the
What would have happened is that later on it must have been used as the POW camp. Because
Absolutely.
the POW started coming only
Sorry.
because the POW started coming in only towards 44. That same thing happened to Clement Town in Dehradun. It is not that Clement Town was made for the POW. It is that the Clement Town was a good place to keep the POW.
Yes. Okay. Mangesh wants to say.
I just like to add an anecdote. At the end of World War II, somewhere in 1945, there was a press conference in London where the British Prime Minister, he's known as the Iron Man of World War II, Churchill, was asked by the BBC correspondent, which was an event which really frightened you during World War II. And everyone was expecting Operation Barbarossa, or let's say the Rommel marching over in Europe from the North Africa, taking over North Africa. He said what happened in Sri Lanka, where the largest British fleet ever assembled was sunk. That was his most frightening moment.
This is very interesting. And to take it further from here, there's another story by Mangesh, and in which he brings out a very unique fact as to the operations which happened in World War II, within India. We all have heard about, the very German U-boats which were there and how they had, interrupted the entire North Atlantic convoys. But rarely do we hear about U-boat operations in the Arabian Sea or Bay of Bengal. So there is one legendary U-boat called U-181, which in the span of 5 weeks had sunk about 46 allied commercial ships in the Arabian Sea. And how it was happening is because they had a communication connect with Goa, which was at that time under the Portuguese rule, and from where the German commercial ships had probably, docked in. They were carrying the radio sets, the port books, and time to time the U-181 would surface and, take on those ports, take on the coordinates and target the shipping. And the British found a very unique way of dealing with this. And that was that a group of ex-army men from Calcutta Lighthouse, or CLH, they embarked on an operation by which they took on a tug from Calcutta. The tug was then, sailed right next to its coast, all the way down the eastern coast, sailed around Sri Lanka, came to Goa, wherein they had, absolute surprise and sinking the German spy ship, and then making their getaway. Incidentally, when they made the getaway, they came back here in Mumbai, very nearby here itself, and then did the operations. Now, question to you is, Sachin, to you, that when we see this kind of operation taking place, secrecy of operations, I would say the use of that time technology, which was quite pretty antique in terms of navigation, reaching with pinpoint accuracy to that place, and finally executing the operations, as also getting that information, collating, making sure that that kind of presence has been felt and made over there, and then making a mark. How do you relate it to the modern day technology? I mean, in today's world where things are so open, the tracking of the ships, the tracking of assets in terms of aircraft and ships is known to a lot of people. How we can imbibe technology for our defense industry or the industries or the intelligence industries in which we can make use of it in a much better manner?
Hi, thank you for inviting me for the panel. This is actually my first panel in a literature festival, so which is a pretty unique experience. Just to set the context, in terms of perhaps I should spend a few words describing my background in just a little bit, just so that the context is clear. So my background is in cyber security and for the last 25 years with both the private sector and the government, more recently with the government. And cyber operations. So I can't say more than that, but it's essentially right up the street that you just asked me the question about. So some of the things, first of all, Mangesh, fascinating book. I thoroughly enjoyed reading. I haven't finished reading all of it. It's quite a large, involved volume, but it's very interesting. And some of the stories that you you have narrated in the semi-fictional style are actually extremely interesting because they have a lot of parallels, and one can draw a lot of parallels in terms of how those operations were planned and executed and successful to the modern world. Right? So, in fact, just maybe an hour later, or maybe 2 hours later, I have a talk in Homi State University where I'm going to talk about psychological operations and cognitive warfare operations in the age of cyber and AI. So how that's increasing scale, sophistication, and where technology plays a role. So to answer your question, I think things have become both more difficult and easier. So let me put it this way. So if I wanted to track a ship today, anywhere in the seas, or if I wanted to track an aerial asset in the sky, I can make use of commodity hardware and software to do it. So I call it democratization and commoditization of spy technology in a sense. Something that was the exclusive purview of the privileged few that were in organizations and agencies, such as the kind of agencies that I worked with in the past, is now pretty much available to a lot of different people. So that brings the bad as well, because if you're the adversary, then they could do the same to you. So it's possible to track. It's also possible to disrupt. Now you're seeing GNSS interference attacks in large parts of the airspace, especially in conflict zones or around conflict zones. Our commercial pilots often report that when they approach a certain part of the airspace, they see a lot of disruption. Even in the vicinity of commercial airports in India, they see a lot of disruption, and which they have to work their way through. They have to move on to other systems of navigation just to make sure that they are able to land in the navigate safely into the skies, for example. Oh, okay. Sorry for that. Like I said, it's my first experience with the microphone. All right. So, but if you're an adversary, you could weaponize this technology against your enemies, which would be us. And as India ascends and we become more assertive, and this is something that NSA sir recently spoke at a conference, which I had the privilege to attend. He said that as we ascend, as we become more assertive, as we trade with Russia and we negotiate with China and we confront the United States, we are going to make friends, but we're also going to make greater enemies. And so we are going to become more targeted, right? So whether it's the Chinese or whether it's our so-called friends who might not be so friendly with us anymore, they're going to use those techniques and procedures against us, but the barrier to entry for use of those tactics and techniques is very low now. I remember back in the government when I was asked to set up a certain team and develop a certain capability in some of these areas. It was pretty hard because this was around 7 or 8 years ago, and the world has changed since then. If I wish I was in that position now than I was 10 years ago, because it took me a long time to do things that I could do within days and weeks now with the existing technology that we have, whether it's artificial intelligence or whether it's more sophisticated hardware or cheaper hardware, commodity hardware, open source tools. What we don't sometimes realize is that the adversaries don't necessarily have legal constraints. They don't need AI guardrails. Now we talk about artificial intelligence, we need guardrails. We need to make sure that the AI that we use, whether it's ChatGPT or whether it is Gemini or Claude, don't do things that they're not supposed to do. But the adversaries don't think that. They jailbreak these models and they use it to do anything they want. For example, I can develop malware on Claude, which has been jailbroken, but most people here will not be able to do that. If you try to tell the AI, make me a software that will allow me to penetrate a computer system, they say, sorry, I'm not allowed to do that. But that doesn't mean the adversaries cannot, because they have techniques by which they have jailbroken these models. They have broken out of their comfort zone and are asking these models to do things that they're not meant to do. So what I'm trying to say in a nutshell is that the barrier to entry is reduced, the cost of the operation is reduced, the risk associated with that, especially in the cyber domain and the electronic domain, because it is intrinsically anonymous, and you don't have to expose yourself. We could be sitting far behind in a very nondescript location, non-attributable, at least not back to us, and we could still perform an operation successfully without ever being noticed. So I think that anonymity has increased, which is intrinsic anyway in in the type of operations that we do, cyber, electronic. And I think it's just becoming easier. And so we need to be on guard in terms of anticipating these attacks and more of these attacks to come in the future. Like Ms. Gowalji said, it's going to happen, it's going to happen with greater frequency, scale and sophistication.
Yeah, that's very interesting, and I think the bite force of all kinetic operations definitely need support of cyber bites. That's what is what we require. Mangesh, anything which you would like to add on to this? Any in this story? Any particular aspect which you would like to bring up?
Not really. If you have some anecdotes, you could just mention them.
Like the way the team of the ex-army men who sailed were actually trained by the Navy. That's the second instance in your book where the army persons were sailed by the Navy, and that two ex-servicemen who carried out this kind of an operation and maintained this kind of secrecy. And what was the threat which you had mentioned that the German and the Italian ships got scuttled in Goa? If the British government also had given that probably Goa would also be captured if such operations continue. Anything of that?
So there was a decision campaign run by MI6. Portuguese was a neutral territory. Britain, being an active member of the World War II, could not invade it because Portugal was neutral. So they had to hatch a plan about how to destroy these 3 German ships which are transmitting signals to a submarine U-boat which is around 200 kilometers off the coast of Bombay, and that was sinking the cargo ships which are taking cotton, iron and other raw materials from Bombay Harbour to UK. So basically they were hammering the supply of the British Empire, the raw material, which was going in London. So Calcutta Light Horse was a British regiment. It was actually the commanding officer once upon a time was Lord Mountbatten. And so they hatched MI6 along with the Special Operations Executive, which was the predecessor of Special Air Service, which is a British Special Operations equivalent to our Para-SF. They operate now. So SOE and the Calcutta Light Horse, they launched this operation. And this was kept under strict secrecy because Portugal was again a neutral colony. So they went inside, destroyed the ships, and there are 2 parties. One which came on the Phoebe barge from Calcutta, as you mentioned. It entered through Cochin to the Arabian Sea, to the coastal water. Other team went by train from Calcutta to Madras, from Madras to Kochi, and they joined the Phoebe barge. And they went and destroyed the ships. And the whole operation was wonderful because at the time of the operation, the MI6 actually took all the sailors from those 3 ships to a party on a hill in Panji, or on the outskirts of Panji, so they would not revolt or they would not fight back. And they started seeing the fireworks. They also saw to it that there are no rickshaws or any other cycles nearby the party, whereby these people could come back and launch a counter-offensive. So that was interesting, the entire planning. And after that, the Phoebe came back to Bombay. It had, nobody knew about the operation in Bombay. It was under the British government. And it was parked right outside Gateway of India, about 100, 200 meters from the Gateway of India. The captain of the Phoebe came down. He went to Kolaba Army Station to report. And that's how the entire operation was revealed later. And there was another, actually the one which you mentioned in the earlier story, the Ramdas College singing station.
Yeah.
That was, by the way, largest singing station of the British military outside Bletchley Park.
Yeah.
So that's one more anecdote.
I think we can add to this anecdote that U-181, about which we have been talking. This was a rare distinction of surviving the entire war. And post the surrender of Germany, this boat was handed over to the Japanese, who named it I-501. And finally, with the fall of Japan, it surrendered in Singapore on 15th August 1945, and a month later it was scuttled. So, the predecessor of this boat, U-181, was U-180, and interestingly, that is a boat in which Subhash Chandra Bose sailed from Kiel in Germany, halfway across till the coast of the southern tip of Africa, where he was transferred onto a Japanese submarine, and then taken further. Okay. Now, having seen this, we come to another interesting story which has been mentioned, and that relates to two powerful countries of today, in which probably foreign minister of a country, when he's about to land, and the premier of the country flees from the capital to a nearby safety zone, fearing that while this gentleman has come for a peace talks, there might be a chance that he might just be taken away. So this is a story on River Suri and the Zhenbao Island incident, which happened on the Sino-Soviet border in 1969, which Mangesh has mentioned. And it was Kosygin, the foreign minister of Russia, Soviet Union, was that time coming to Beijing for talks. And that's the time when Mao was advised and he moved to Wuhan of the COVID fame now for safety, fearing that he might be taken away. Now, Mangesh, I'll request if you can just very briefly, dwell upon this, the background of the entire incident, how it happened, and what were the ramifications of that.
So just at the start of the Cold War, this was something around 1950-55, there were two communist powers. One was the Soviet Union and one was the China. And China wanted to go the other way, break out and become the leader of the communist world. The third was the Cuba. So there was a tussle going on between the Chinese Communist Party and the Soviet Union Communist Party. And they have this small island over the river Ussuri. It's on the northern border of China and Russia in Siberia. And there's a Zhenbao Island. So Zhenbao Island was not a defined territory, either belonging to China or Russia, but the Soviet Union during that time. So the Chinese army launched an offensive against the Soviet forces on Zhenbao Island. And initially, in the first night of fighting, they killed and destroyed a lot of Soviet hardware, including the APCs and tanks, and many people were also killed. The second counter-offensive was launched by the Soviets, I think after 8 or 9 days, and that was quite a successful operation. And when this operation was going on, China was also talking with Nixon. If you see the ping-pong diplomacy, that is roots in this Ussuri conflict. The Americans, as they are, they say, let's drive a wedge between China and Russia, Soviet Union during that time. And that's when Kissinger in the White House spoke to Nixon and he says, let's shake hands with Mao. And they had a parallel line of communications between Mao and the White House led by Kissinger taking place during that time.
Dr. Sanjeev, I just have a question for you. When we see this entire scenario building up in 60s, and I'll address this part again later in the course of the conversation, we have, certain very strong personalities. Their own very strong traits. Like if you take Mao, Christ Islam was rancid. And every time, it was publicized in a very glorified manner. This whole thing started off about 5 or 6 years back when Khrushchev visited him. And Mao held the meeting in a swimming pool, knowing very well that the other guys are non-swimmer. So, what in your views are, firstly, the impact of such strong political personalities, especially in countries which are today very powerful, super powerful, economically powerful, and not fully democratic? That's one. And second is, by the time this incident, got over, the Soviet Union and India came very close. And the Soviet-India treaty of friendship, which later on fructified, and in a manner was a very strong point for the 71 operations, also came into being. Your views on these two aspects?
There are many aspects to this question. The first is that when you have a regime like the Soviets or the Chinese, those are regimes in which the Communist Party is very, very strong. Now, there are regimes in which a leader has to be powerful, is not based on consensus. It does not depend on what the people around him think or want. In fact, his power lies in absolute control. Now, that is where Khrushchev lost out. Khrushchev, and for that matter, later on, these other people who lost out before Putin, Gorbachev and the others. You see, they lost out because they were not understanding the nature of power in a CPSU or in a CPC or in a PLA or in the setup which North Korea has. See, every leader has to work according to the ecosystem in which he has to come up. We have to operate in the ecosystem of Election Commission of India, for example. You can be populist, you can be doing this, you can be doing that, but there are boundary conditions which India has, there are boundary conditions UK has, So in the case of Mao and Khrushchev, Mao was exerting full authority and full control, and Khrushchev lost out in that battle. Gorbachev lost out in that battle. In fact, when nations or when leaders do not understand the ecosystem in which they have to operate, then there is a problem. Of course, you have exceptions like Trump, who changed the ecosystem in which they operate. But then there is a larger question: when do leaders like Trump emerge? What are the conditions in which populism becomes very strong? What are the reasons why today you have Meloni on one side, Putin on the other side, Xi on the other side, even our Prime Minister? Why is it that they are asserting themselves the way they are asserting themselves is because their immediate predecessors have created a space for them. So all intelligent political leaders, and let us remember that in politics, the revenue model is to come back to power. There is no point being a Vibhu Vaibhav in politics. In politics is about power, and politics there is a revenue model of power. Mao understood that revenue model. Brezhnev understood that. Brezhnev was a terrible person, but he understood the revenue model. As long as he lived, right? So this is the situation that we have to understand. And one thing that also becomes very clear in the Soviet-Chinese conflict is that at the end of the day, nationalism trumps ideology. Nationalism has always trumped ideology. And for all that you might say, workers of the world unite, Catholics of the world unite, Protestants of the world unite, Muslims of the world unite, it does not happen. It does not happen. Right? So that is the larger context in which we have to place political personality.
That's very fascinating because this also links up, in some manner to the next story of Mangesh, and that's about, Operation Naval Archer, which happened in the early 80s, 1983 to be sure. And I'll link a part of this question to what you explained also. So, this is a story which Mangesh has written about Operation Archer, which happened in the Reagan era. And this was the time when the US and the NATO forces, they decided to step up and increase, the level of activities, the exercises within Europe, and up the ante, as what we say. Initiatives like, the SDI, the Strategic Defense Initiative, Star Wars Initiative, that came up into being. The naval flotillas or the carrier battle groups became much more active. So there was a lot of, I would say, uncertainty which was there the world over in that times. So, Dr. Sanjeev, my question again in relation to this is a very, very critical decade if you see, 1979 to 1989. And it has sort of a similar analogy what we are seeing here today. We had very strong personalities. We had Ronald Reagan, we had Arnold Pope, who came from a KGB background. We had Thatcher, who was riding on the Falkland War euphoria at that time. And if you look at it today, what people we have today, Trump, Putin, we have Netanyahu, and even our own Prime Minister in that way. There are strong personalities who are driving nationalism, and nationalism is driving the agenda of the worldwide. So do you see similarities at that time and this time, and what's really the impact of that push?
Well, I think this time it is far more intense because, as he said, the technology of disruption has become very common. So earlier, what could happen, what could have been done only by a few people. Now it can be done by anyone. I mean, you see, today the challenge is not just between state to state; it is also between state and non-state actors. You do not require a territory. You do not require a very visible personality. It can happen anywhere, anytime. So it's a very different scenario. But having said that, one thing we must understand is, and I am talking about the long march of history. At various points of time, in the 50s and the 60s, you had socialism, which was very strong. Then you have nationalism, which becomes strong. Then you have a favor in favor of a global world. You have a time when global institutions become strong. You have a time when global institutions become weak. So let us not look at the history of any 10 years. Let us not look at the history of any decade to think that is the marching, line of civilization. I'll just take a minute to explain to you. You see, in the last 3 or 4 decades, the last few years that you and I and all of us sitting here have been reading, you see all the theories have collapsed. You had the Huntington thesis, Clash of Civilizations, on Kaputski. You had Francis Fukuyama saying end of history. But here is the end of history. History is beginning every time. You had Friedman saying the world is flat and geography does not matter. The fact is geography does matter. Geography does matter. You have a 10,000 kilometer Iran thing. So 10,000 marines क्या करेंगे वहाँ पे? You will require You will require a whole set of people to be there, and that will mean body bags back home. And when body bags go back home, the importance of geography will come up. The importance of geography insofar as Iran is concerned, Iran is not just Iran, Iran is also Persia, Iran is also Parthe, Iran is also Darius, Iran is also, Iran, they take it back to the times of the Roman Empire, when whoever wanted to conquer it has gone. So let us look at it in a very long duration. So this Trump today, as I was mentioning in the morning poem, that I said, this Trump today, this Putin, all these people will be dustbins of history. A few years from now, I mean, in this room, because we're all interested in history, we know about Achal Lake, we know about General Slim. Get out of this room. Let's get out of this room and ask a few people who is Slim. They'll say it's probably a capsule to get Slim. I mean, how many people would know about all this? So let us look at history in a much larger canvas. When we look at history in a much larger canvas, I do not think that today is the most defining moment in history. It is there. It has always been there, and this will continue. So I'm a bit. If you study history, you realize that all these things keep happening. They keep going. So I won't give too much importance to these individuals. These individuals are there because the few years before them were situations which allowed them to become as strong as they were. For instance, let's put it very clearly. If there was no appeasement, if there is no appeasement, there can be no backlash. When there is too much backlash, it will again lead to a situation where people will say, why this backlash? So you have a movement against migrants, then you have Suketu Mehta writing this book that migrants are most welcome. So it'll all change with time. So sometimes Germany welcomes, today Germany is saying we want more workers. They don't want Turkish workers, that's another matter. But they're looking forward to getting more workers. So every time, situations will change. Migration, I'll tell you see, whether you look at migration in Punjab, whether you look at migration in Bombay, whether you look at migration, today the world cannot survive without migrants. And yet nobody is willing to say that migrants are welcome because and that's something which I'm thinking. You see, politics is determined by those who vote for you. But larger populations are moving without a vote, right? So the politician will go wherever the vote is, irrespective of what is good or what is bad, because a politician has to address his voters. And let us not underestimate the mind of the politician. He takes a lot of risk. He takes more risk than you and I take.
Yeah, that's true. And one important aspect about this entire era was the way the Reagan administration brought in the whole narrative about the Star Wars and the Strategic Defense Initiative. And Sachin, this question is to you. What was started off by Reagan has not yet been achieved. What they professed that they thought, and what the Soviets probably wanted, and maybe in trying to catch up, aided in their collapse or whatever happened. So in today's time, if you see narrative building, the world has changed. Social media is so active. The cyber domain is so active. The younger generations, shaping of mind is so much more prominent. What in your viewpoint is the importance of narrative building and looking at the personality traits of the people?
Okay, so right, social media, right? Good or evil? Social media is probably the best tool, or if I may say even a weapon, that has emerged in the last decade, which has literally excited the fans out of a lot of these people in the government, as well as in some cases in the defense forces, from a psychological operations perspective or perception management, influence operations perspective. Social media has done what none of the earlier tools could do, right? First of all, with social media, you can reach in some cases, the right demographic at a very vast scale. We're talking about hundreds of millions of users at the same time. The social media platforms survive because they have excellent algorithms. These algorithms that work in the back end are the algorithms that are responsible for giving us or delivering the content we want to see, or what they have determined you want to see based on our viewing habits. So, which is why, of course, a lot of countries are now banning social media for under 16s. In fact, I believe Bangalore is the first city that has now banned social media for under 16s. Now, how that is actually going to be implemented or enforced is yet another challenge, because it's not easy to do unless you have very strict and well implemented controls for age verification and so on. And even then, those are easily defeated, these controls. But essentially, these algorithms allow you to deliver content in a we call it micro-targeting. In influence operations, in cyber operations, we call it micro-targeting. So for example, this is anecdotally, if I was interested in delivering a specific type of social media content on a specific social media platform, let's assume it's Instagram, and I wanted to deliver the content specifically to 13 to 19-year-old teenagers in Oklahoma City in America, if I had the correct access and understanding of the social media algorithms, and if I had hooks inside the social media companies like Facebook, Meta, for example, or even others like X, formerly Twitter, I can actually do micro-targeting. I can actually target specific content to specific slice of that demographic in a specific country, geography, and so on. And the type of content can also be tailored. I can even decide the time of the day or the night during which this content is to be targeted, or I can decide multiple permutations, combinations thereof. Now, this might seem very complicated, but it's actually not very complicated. In fact, in previous efforts in this area, can't go into too many details, but we actually hired social media specialists, as well as ex-staff from these social media companies that work in their Indian global capability centers and so on, to make sure that we had the right technical talent to be able to do it. Right? So what I'm saying is the amplification factor is huge. The others, and there are lessons we learned from the past decade. So between 2016 to 2026, I know you said that we shouldn't be focusing on a decade, but I'm once again going to focus on a decade because it's very illustrative. I'll give you an example. In 2023, I was approached by a very large tier 1 bank in India, asking me whether I could articulate the current cyber threat landscape to their executive team. And I said, okay, sure, I'll do that. And guess what? ChatGPT, generative AI did not figure in that presentation because this was early 2023, April 2023 to be exact. ChatGPT and generative AI and the threats associated with generative AI and the use of AI in general did not emerge in public and popular consciousness until June of 2023. So literally those 2 months made a difference to the extent that I had to actually send an addendum to my presentation to say, here are 2 more slides that you need to take a look at. One of them was the inevitable risks associated with use of AI, depending on which side you are on. And of course, social media was always there, and you know, critical infrastructure organizations do suffer a lot from misuse of social media. I mean, you have banks where scams propagate on social media. You have WhatsApp messages, and you're all aware of that, right? Yeah. So, but from a influence operations perspective, social media is an invaluable tool. And now there are so many tools to allow you to use that tool very effectively as well. And most of these are very low cost. And governments that plan and sustain these types of influence operations programs, the budget is usually not a concern for them. Just to give an anecdotal example, in 2021-22, the Chinese did an influence operation, which is still ongoing. And one doesn't really know where the center of mass or center of gravity of that network still lies. So they are unable to take it down very effectively because this was Ministry of Public Security. MPS, they had a special group that they created, and that group was given the mandate of performing global influence operations on social media. They infiltrated 50 plus social media platforms, and they have infected them to such a deep level. It's like a parasite that has entered, and now they have the infrastructure. Meta, in a congressional testimony to the Congress, Mark Zuckerberg said it wasn't very effective. For example, 30% of their YouTube video channels had no subscribers. And he also mentioned that most of these videos actually had no views. So he meant to say that their operation was unsuccessful. But what is to say that this was not a trial run? What is to say that this was not simply a measure? They were investing in infrastructure, testing it, and making sure that it can be activated at any point in time. So I think it's becoming increasingly easier.
That's fantastic. That's really fantastic. And just a quick word from you, Mangesh, because we had that unfortunate South Korean Cal 007 aircraft shooting down also. Safeguard your opinion as against others. Your view on that.
So there are a lot of things which are happening, as Vibhu said, from 1979 to 1989. 1989, the Soviet Union disappeared into 11 different countries. And KAL is a Korean airline 001 or 007. 007. Actually, two Korean airlines were taking off from Alaska at that time with a gap of 1 hour. And KAL 007 actually straight into Kamchatka Peninsula, which was the submarine base, very secret, top secret submarine base of the Soviet Navy. And it was shot down. But the United States, it is straight back into the territory around 350 kilometers inside the Soviet territory. So obviously it was shot down because it's a Cold War, kind of a hot war underpinnings are also there to that area. Then the Americans took the advantage and they turned it into a propaganda campaign. So coming back today, what is happening in the Middle East during the Iranian conflict, we are actually monitoring the flights which are taking off in Dubai. So Dubai airport since 28th October for the next 7 to 8 days was shut down because Iranians were sending in their missiles and drones, and they had also targeted the airport. But now subsequently, I think from February 10th onwards, the airport is open sporadically, depending on the drones and missiles coming, and the flights are also operating. And the graph of flights operating, Etihad, Emirates, and Qatar has shot up now to pre-Iranian conflict levels, pre-February 28 levels. Coming back, misidentification. Around 5 years back or 6 years back, one Iranian battery in Tehran shot down an Ukrainian aircraft, misidentification. This happened, I think, in 2019 or 2023 COVID. Then, in 1986, as you said, USS Vincennes shot down an Iranian airliner. Again, it was in peace times. All people dead. And there are various instances. So, currently, if you see the KEL incident, these 3 incidents have happened. I'm working in a private organization leading the security function. We have staff around 35 in Dubai, 15 in Tehran, and around 65 in the overall area. And we are worried. So we have issued a kind of a fatwa that people should not transit from Dubai, people should not take Emirates, then Qatar and Etihad Airways. Because these airlines are still operating on their commercial timetables in a zone which is active. Tomorrow we might see some aircraft of these 3 airlines shot down. So going back to what happened that time, we have still not learned these 3 tragedies, USS Vincennes, the Iranian tragedy 5-6 years back, and the KAL 007. So geopolitically what I have seen is that it's a crude saying, but it's very applicable. History repeats itself and we don't learn from it. And this is going on and on.
That's true, and I think in Able Archer also, the kind of mistrust, lack of communication, led to that huge build-up, which the Western world had never seen, and the Eastern Bloc also responded. And it's very interesting, since we're having this discussion here today, within, I can see Prabal Das Gupta, that's why I'm remembering that, 3 to 4 years down the line, we had a similar build-up happening with India conducting exercise brass tracks and Pakistan responded with Zarbe movement. So Prabal, I think 83-84 when Jan Sundarji was army commander, can I ask you a question that in your view, do you feel that there was some kind of an inspiration which came from Able Archer for him? Mike. I know he is your inspiration to write a story, but we would love to know that was Able Archer inspiration for him to dream about the brass tracks?
Hi. Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Hi. Thanks, Vibhu. Thanks for such a wonderful session. I don't want to take away much time because we're running a little short, but I'll keep it very brief. Able Archer, again a great story, Mangesh. 82, 83, 83 I think. And brass tacks happened in 1986, 87. There are certain similarities. I would say brass tacks was 4 times bigger than a NATO exercise, which we'll talk about shortly. General Sundarji, we don't know whether he was inspired by it, but I think given the fact that he trained in the US in Fort Leavenworth in the 1960s, when he comes back, he has some of these large, big theatre ideas. When 1983 happened, General Sundarji had already prepared for something in 1981. Perhaps it gave him that push that this could happen. 1983, it brought to the two powers, the Soviet Union and the Americans, close to a possible nuclear conflict. 1987, brass tacks brought India and Pakistan close to war. Some of these other things that happened, I don't want to give away. Sandeep is staring at me.
I think you will have it in the next panel discussion, and I think this panel probably raise the AQA for that. I think we have time for just one question, maybe. Yeah. Yeah, please. There's somebody behind here. The gentleman behind. Yes, sir. Somebody there.
Yeah. First priority to you. First priority to you. I have a comment.
Yeah.
So I want to ask, nowadays there is a debate going on that whether the freedom we earn is a real freedom. Haven't we paid the real price in the blood to get this freedom? Because if we have not paid enough blood to get this freedom, then it is we got it in big harm. So this connect to the so the thing that the theatre in the East, where the Netaji joined the Japanese to get a freedom. But we learned that Japanese were treated, the INA soldiers or the people who went to fight British Empire and they joined the Japanese, but they were treated very, very badly. They were killed like anything. They were given the labor job instead of the fighting. That is the thing. So see, think of, had the Japanese won or the Germans won, and instead of they replaced the British Queen with the Japanese Empire, would we have been a better? Because those people, Japanese, were even the worse than the British. So what is your idea? Because nowadays the violence has been encouraged that we will not fight. Thank you. This is Sanjeev.
Well, there's another. Is it related to this? Well, you see, this is and later in the evening we have another session on this. It's a very contested story. It's a very, very contested story. The fact is that the INA basically was composed of the POWs. And it was also a fact that they were called JIPs, that is the Japanese Indian Fifth Columnists or whatever. The fact is that they were treated as a labor corps. We cannot deny that fact. Because every large army or every large country looks at it from his perspective or from the nation's perspective. So from the perspective of Japan, we were being used. But the same thing can also be said that as far as the British India was concerned, we were then also being used as a tool, because when we sent out, you see, 2.5 million people went out to the World War. I mean, from the India side, there were 1.3 million in the First World War. So whether it was the British or whether it was the Japanese, as long as we do not have sovereign political power, as long as you do not have sovereign political power, you will be used. You will be used. So I will not be able to comment on what would have happened. But what was most important was to understand is that we were being used by the Britishers, we were being used by the Japanese. So until we got our own freedom, it would have been very difficult. Having said that, because there were more Indian officers in the British Indian Army, and because that army was becoming more and more, I would say, Indian, and because the bulk of the 2.5 million people who had joined the British Indian Army were volunteers. Nobody had compelled anyone to join the British Indian Army. So I think that factor we have to keep in mind when we balance the equation between what happened to these 50,000 troops of the INA and the 2.5 million troops that we had in the World War II.
We have just one quick question.
Vibhu, Sunita is standing
Yes.
Yeah.
Sorry, so,
We can
Vibhu, one
discuss
last
on the
comment.
side.
one last comment which adds to this.
Yeah, please.
You know, just a very quick one. No need for the why. Two things. Your blitzkrieg that you mentioned beautifully, that history is not covered. It was also as a part of that raid on Visakhapatnam, which actually had many fantastic consequences, including the growth of Visakhapatnam today as a major hub. You know, because they did an air raid. There was the Royal Air Force started with an air squadron there. The port grew. A couple of years down the line, Walchand Hirachand from Mumbai established the Hindustan Shipyard, one of our sponsors. So in some ways, the Japanese thrust there helped Vizag grow. That's an interesting story. And there was a huge amphibious preparation for the Arakkal, which again the Royal Indian Navy did. That's not been written about in history at all. That Kolkata Light Horse operation is been made into a beautiful movie called The Sea Wolves. And in which the governor of Goa is played by a gentleman called Admiral Rusi Gandhi, one of our great war heroes. And Rusi was one of the most flamboyant personalities in the Navy. So he plays governor of Goa in The Sea Wolves, which is based on this opera.
lovely. Let's have a huge round of applause. Thank you, Sachin, Mangesh, Dr. Sanjeev Chopra, and Vibhu.